Scholar, alongside White Mage, is one of the two original healers. Being the more defensive of the pair, they specialize in powerful shields and mitigations rather than White Mage's potent heals. They're also the more complex of the two, having a kit with various interactions and somewhat strange restrictions. But with that being said, here's everything you need to know about our only pet-based healer. So to begin, let's talk about their spells and abilities. Starting at level 1, you get your main damaging single target spell, Rune, which will eventually be upgraded to Royal. At level 2, you get your Dot in Bio that is later upgraded to Biolysis, which, like Rune, will be one of your main sources of damage throughout the game. At level 4, you get your first heal in Physic, which is a rather weak single target option. That is somewhat outclassed by the other ability you get at this level, Summon Eos, which, as the name implies, summons Eos, your fairy companion that will passively heal nearby injured targets. At level 12, you get Resurrection, which, like Eos, does what the name implies, resurrecting any KO'd targets. At level 20, you get your first AoE healing option in Whispering Dawn, which is also our first proper fairy ability. An important thing to know about Scholar is that many of their abilities are directly tied to the fairy, and so using said abilities not only require the fairy to be summoned, but also originate from the fairy. Meaning when you hit Whispering Dawn, the ability isn't going to come from you, but rather the fairy, which means that you may have moments where you need to pre-position Eos before using the ability to make sure that everyone is able to get hit. At level 30, you get one of Scholar's bread and butter skills, their first shield, the single target Ad Loquium, which gives you a shield equal to 180% of the heal. And if it crits, you get a second shield for another 180%, which is why Scholar is able to produce some incredibly large shields. At level 35, you get your second shield ability in your AoE Sucker that is later upgraded to Concentration. Like Adlo, it grants a shield based on its heal, except instead of 180%, it's 160%. Also, it's important to note that unlike Adlo, it doesn't receive a bonus shield from crits that's unique to your single target. At level 38, you get Rune 2, which is weaker than your normal Rune/Broil, but in exchange, it's an instant cast ability, meaning you can use it for extra mobility. At level 40, you get your second fairy ability with Fey Illumination that, this time around, instead of a heal, you get an AoE magic mitigation that also provides a small healing magic buff. Now, an important thing to know about healing buffs is that they come in two forms, healing magic and healing actions. Healing magic buffs only affect abilities marked as spells, usually meaning they are GCD heals, whereas a healing action buff applies to any form of healing. So for Fey Illumination, it will only buff your Adlo, Sucker, or Physic, not your Whispering Dawn. At level 45, you get access to one of your job's key abilities, Aetherflow. Using this ability restores 20% of your mana and grants 3 stacks of Aetherflow, which is a resource you use to execute your other abilities like Energy Drain and Lustrate, both of which are also obtained at level 45. Energy Drain is a weak single target damaging ability that restores health equal to the damage it deals, and Lustrate is a potent single target heal. At level 46, you get your first AoE in Art of War, and as a general rule of thumb, Art of War is usually better than single target at 2 or more targets. At level 50, you get yet another one of your Aetherflow abilities in Sacred Soil, which is a bubble that you're able to place anywhere in the arena, and anyone standing inside of it will receive a 10% mitigation. This ability is later upgraded to gain a regen as well. At level 52, you get yet another Aetherflow ability in Indomitability, which is a potent AoE heal. At level 56, you get Deployment Tactics, which is an ability that enables Scholar to give parties massive shields, as all it does is take the shield from your Adlo and spread it to all nearby allies, which is why Scholar is so efficient at making incredibly large shields for their entire party. At level 58, you get Emergency Tactics, which simply converts the shield part of your GCD heals into a pure heal. And then at level 60, the pinnacle skill for Heavensward is Dissipation, which is our first anti-synergy ability, because Dissipation consumes our fairy for 30 seconds, in exchange for a hefty healing magic buff and 3 stacks of Aetherflow, all of which aren't affected by said healing buff because it's healing magic, not healing actions. Now, because you're consuming your fairy, it's also important to note that any abilities involving your fairy are not able to be used until the effect of dissipation ends and your fairy is re-summoned. Hence, it being an anti-synergy ability, and it's not going to be our last one. At level 62, you get your last Aetherflow ability, Excogitation, which places a buff on a target that will provide a powerful heal after one of two things happen. Either the target falls below 50% or the buff expires. At level 66, you get arguably one of your most important abilities for team play, Chain Stratagem, which is a raid buff that makes a single target take more critical hits. At level 70, you get your pinnacle ability for Stormblood, Aether Pact, which by unlocking will now cause your Aetherflow abilities to generate fairy gauge if the fairy is present. That fairy gauge can then be used for Aether Pact, which will cause your fairy to tether to a player, healing them until the ability is stopped or you run out of your fairy gauge. At level 74, you get possibly the strongest ability in your kit with Recitation, which grants a free use of Adlo, Sucker, Indom, or Excog, while also forcing that ability to be a critical heal. At level 76, you get yet another fairy ability with Phase Blessing, which is just a small AoE heal. And then at level 80, we get our pinnacle ability for Shadowbringers, along with our next anti-synergy ability, Summon Seraph. Like Dissipation, this ability makes it so you lose your fairy for a short time, replacing them with a Seraph instead. Now, while you have Seraph summoned, you gain access to 2 charges of Consolation, which is a rather potent AoE heal/shield. Angel Whispering Dawn and Fey Illumination change into Angel's Whisper and Seraphic Illumination. Now, both these abilities are the exact same, and all the name change does is make it so you can actually use them while Seraph is active, because things like Phase Blessing or Aether Pact, which don't get Seraph versions, can't be used while Summon Seraph is active because they require your fairy, not the Seraph, hence anti-synergy. But those aren't the only abilities that are turned off by Seraph, as you're also unable to use Dissipation, as that ability requires you to consume your fairy, and Seraph is not your fairy, so if you want to use Dissipation, you have to wait until your Summon Seraph ends. At level 86, you get Protraction, a single target buff that not only increases the target's maximum HP, but also provides a healing action buff on them as well, meaning that all healing on them is increased. At level 90, you get your pinnacle ability for Endwalker Expedient, an AoE mitigation that also provides a movement speed buff for a short time. At level 92, you get a new AoE dot with Baneful Impaction, which is a follow-up ability to your Chain Stratagem. Then at level 100, you get Seraphism, our newest anti-synergy ability. So like Seraph and Dissipation, this ability requires the fairy to be used. However, unlike the other two, it doesn't consume it, meaning you still have access to all your fairy abilities, and you can even summon Seraph without losing the effect. That can't be said about Dissipation, which, if you use, will instantly end the effect of Seraphism. But with that being said, what does Seraphism do? Well, when activated, your character transforms, causing all nearby allies to be passively healed, and your Adlo and Concentration are upgraded to Manifestation and Accession, which are both slightly more powerful and instant, meaning you're able to heal and move. Unfortunately, unless this is changed at some point in the future, this does come with the downside of limiting your Recitation, as neither of the upgraded abilities can be buffed by it, meaning that while Seraphism is active, you can only use Indom or Excog. When it comes to leveling, Scholar is probably the most consistent healer throughout the entire process, with a rather strong kit that progresses and is added to in a pretty clear way that most people are going to be able to figure out on their own. But with that being said, let's go over the biggest obstacle for healers during leveling: dungeons. Starting with A Realm Reborn, much of your early healing is going to be handled by the fairy, whether through her passive healing or Whispering Dawn. However, as you begin to get into the 30s, you'll start to have to use Adlo and Physic for bigger pulls. Then in the later portions of A Realm Reborn, you'll have things like Lustrate and Soil. Now, the general healing order for A Realm Reborn will look something like this. Adlo the tank before pulling any mobs to give them a shield. Then put your dot on all the enemies as the tank pulls, and once the party stops, place a Soil if it's unlocked, and refresh your Adlo and use Whispering Dawn. Then start damaging the enemies, ideally with your AoE if unlocked, until the tank falls below a percentage you're comfortable with. A good starting point for new healers is about 60 to 70%, at which point you'll want to Lustrate if unlocked, otherwise use an Adlo. Lastly, for high damage pulls where heavy healing is needed, you'll want to alternate between your Adlo and Physic. That way you take full advantage of the shields, because if you use Adlo on a target that still has a shield, it will simply replace the weaker shield, effectively wasting it. Moving into Heavens, where the healing is going to be much the same, with only a couple additions. First off, because of deployment tactics, we can start pre-shielding both the tank and ourselves, using deployment to spread our shield on the tank when theirs breaks. Next, when it comes to heavy healing, we'll want to prioritizing using emergency tactics plus Adlo before we resort to Physic. And lastly, if we run out of lustrates, we can now use Dissipation for 3 more. Speaking of Dissipation, the ideal way to use this ability during dungeons is actually to use it just before you finish a pack, as not only will this give you full Aether Flow for the next pull, but the healing buff will mean you can give the tank a larger shield. Moving into Stormblood, again, not much is going to change. Now instead of using 2 of our Aether Flow on lustrates, instead we'll use XCOG first. We'll also want to use Chain Stratagem on cooldown so that things die faster. And finally, you'll use Aether Pact on any pack where you have 50 plus Fairy Gauge. Now moving into Shadowbringers, this is where we'll start to see our first big shift, mostly because of Recitation, as this allows us to do a pre-pull XCOG, which in most cases heals the tank for about half their health. Meaning that any pull that you have Recitation, the only healing you'll usually need is a Soil plus 2 lustrates. And because of this, we'll start to alternate the abilities that we use in between pulls, with the Recitation pulls being handled as we mentioned before, while the other pulls will be using things like Whispering Dawn, Fey Blessing, and Aether Pact. Then, if extra healing is needed, we can use Summon Sarah. And this is basically the healing plan that you'll use for the rest of your leveling. In truth, from this point on, you'll honestly start to have moments where you barely need to do any healing at all. But to quickly talk about our last 2 expansions, with Endwalker, you can use Protraction to buff your different heals, most notably Aether Pact, as it will buff the entire duration of it. As for Expedient, while you can use it as an extra mitigation, it's usually better at helping speed up dungeons by using it in between pulls. And then going into Dawntrail, the only real thing to talk about is Seraphism, which you can activate anytime for some passive healing, or in between packs to put shields on the tank while you're moving. With the leveling done, let's now talk about some tips for the endgame and raiding. The first of which is it's fine to play overly cautious and not be optimal. Now, something that you're going to hear constantly is that as a healer, you need to do DPS, as doing damage is important for all 3 roles, and this is a true statement. But what people often neglect to mention is that while it's important to do damage, it's always the secondary goal, as your main goal is healing, especially when you're learning fights. Because the secret to becoming a better healer is optimizing your healing so you're able to do better damage. But in order to optimize your healing, you first have to figure out how you're actually going to heal. And to do that, you have to experiment, you have to learn. Figuring out when and where you want to use the different parts of your kit while also trying to synergize with your co-healer. But at the same time that you're experimenting, you also have to keep your party alive, meaning you'll want to use extra GCD heals as added safety until you figure out how you want to heal the different mechanics. And this is especially true for Scholar, as the shields they're able to produce are incredibly powerful. In fact, basically anytime you're learning a fight as Scholar, you'll almost always want to use an AoE shield anytime you see an enemy cast bar. And then as you get more comfortable and start to get a good handle on how much damage is being done and what you need to use to heal it, you can start to cut back on those GCD shields or placing them with broils. So as your healing gets better, so does your damage. While we're on the subject of healing, let's quickly talk about some healing priorities for Scholar. As we mentioned before, one of the most powerful tools in your kit is Recitation, which is amazing considering it is an incredibly short cooldown, as it gives you access to powerful AoE healing with Endom, powerful AoE shields with Adlo and deployment, incredible single target healing with XCOG, and if all else fails, a great emergency tool with Consultation, all wrapped in a 60-second cooldown, making it almost always your go-to option for any healing. But when Recitation isn't available, then you'll want to try to combo other abilities together until it's available again, using things like Face Blessing and Whispering Dawn to heal after raid wides, or using Soil plus Illumination/Expedient to mitigate incoming damage so less damage happens and thus less has to be healed. And if all else fails, you always have your AoE shield concentration, which is always going to be a fantastic tool. Now when it comes to heavy healing, you have Summon Seraph that you'll want to use in those moments where you're having to deal with back-to-back instances of damage. Now the same thing can be said about Seraphism, but you do have to be careful with that ability as you will very quickly go through all of your mana. And generally speaking, it's just better to save it for movement heavy healing. Now while we're talking about these long cooldown heals, a good habit to get into when learning fights is to find the mechanics that you know you'll need them for and then try to time the use of your abilities around that. So if you're doing a fight and then at the 4-minute mark you find a mechanic that you know you're going to need your Summon Seraph for, well, now you know when you need it. And since it's a 2-minute cooldown, that now means you're free to use your Summon Seraph in the first 2 minutes because you don't have to use it until minute 4, which means you're able to make some of your early healing a little easier and optimal. Now moving on to another tip that kind of ties into what we just talked about, you should record yourself. So this is actually useful for improving in any role, but it's especially useful for healers, as not only can you go back and see your mistakes, but you're also able to watch your cooldown timings while not having to worry about the fights you're in, letting you better plan things out. It might also help you realize alternate ways you can heal previous mechanics that would then enable you to heal other mechanics easier. And this is tied directly to our next tip, which is watching other people healing the same fight as Scholar. Look at what they do and see if it's maybe better than what you're doing. See if they do something that maybe you didn't consider and might make your life a little easier. And our next tip is, if you're anxious about healing, then try to find a friend to co-heal with or a casual raid group, as healing with friends or a small casual group is just going to be less stressful than trying to do it with random people in Party Finder. It's also going to be more enjoyable and consistent, which allows you to focus more on improving rather than having to constantly adjust and having to learn to heal with different people. And the final tip I have for you is that you're already doing better than many others. The fact that you're watching this video means that you're actively looking for ways to improve, which is a major factor to actually getting better alongside experience and time. So as long as you're willing to continue looking for ways to improve and get better and actually implement the advice you've received, you'll see improvement, even if it's only a little bit at a time. But with that, we've gone over everything you need to know to get started with Scholar. If you found this helpful, please consider liking the video and possibly subscribing to the channel, and consider checking out this updated leveling guide I made for Dawntrail. With that being said, thank you for watching, and I wish you the best on your healing journey.